are you doing?
That was pretty well. It's too early to answer.
It's 11.
It's still too early to answer.
I've had my coffee. I'm wired.
It's in fact 11:01. We're really good to go.
Yeah. Except unfortunately, it looks like Teresa's not going to be here, which is too bad because it would have been so nice to have had her perspective.
Yeah, Teresa would really like to be here. Have you talked to her?
I have not.
Okay, Patrick, for those of you who don't know, Patrick is Teresa's husband, was down with what they thought was food poisoning for 3 days, really bad, to the point where she was feeding him spoonfuls of gelatin, kind of, you know, and he was having hallucinations. And it turns out it wasn't food poisoning, it turns out it was a norovirus, and now Teresa has it. So she would much rather be here than doing what she's doing.
I'm sure she would. Wow.
And she sends her very profound apologies. We had talked about having her maybe Skype in, but I don't think that's going to happen.
For goodness sake.
I'm here.
Yeah, which is too bad because I think the three of us were tweeting with Ken,
yes,
who evidently found out about this panel kind of by accident.
Kind of because one of us tweeted about it.
Oh, that's right. And he was a little dumbfounded by it. But did very usefully send us to an interview that he had done about it, which was interesting. Let's get going. Let's introduce ourselves. I will start off, and then we can just go down the line, and let's talk about this story. I'm Theodora Goss. I am a fantasy writer, and I've had, I guess, most relevantly for this panel, since we're talking about a short story, I've had a number of short stories out that have been nominated for awards, one the Fantasy Award, but also I teach writing and literature and stories and fantasy, so that's pretty much my background.
I'm Sam Butler. I write as S.C. Butler. I have a slightly different epic fantasy that came out from Tor called The Stoneways. The last book came out, I think, in '09. I've been doing other stuff in between. I'm not much of a short story writer. I do have a few published, mostly in anthologies. I find that to write a 20-page short story probably takes me almost 2 months, whereas to write a 500-page novel takes me a year and a half, and the timing is much better per word on the novel than it is for the short story. I find it really, I think the craft of writing a really good short story is much harder than writing a really good novel because you have to be so much more concise. But that is somebody who prefers writing a novel saying that. So if somebody who prefers writing a short story might say something else different.
No, you're absolutely correct. There's no white space in a short story.
Yeah, there's no white space.
Oh, I want to actually discuss that later on.
Yeah. I mean, well, there's a different kind of white space. There's no room for linguistic faffing about it in a short story.
There's less. Anyway, that's I'm working on a project. I finally got something that I'm trying to sell that's long. Again, I like to refer to it as my Buffy meets Joan of Arc's novel.
Yay.
So.
We'll come back to the white space thing because I want to. Sorry, taking notes. I'm Elizabeth Baer. I write fantasy and science fiction, short and long form. My most recent novel is Rage of Ghosts, which came out from Tor last year. The sequel, Shattered Pillars, is coming out from Tor next month. And
very cool. Very cool.
Thank you. The third book in the series is. I have just hit, I'm taking time off from writing the climax to be here. And I'm waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning going, oh my God, I forgot to do this. So if I seem a little scattered, it's because my head is on another planet currently.
I think we're all scattered here.
Yeah. I'm also involved in a project called Shadow Unit, which is an online, semi-real-time, multi-person episodic narrative that's hard to describe, but a lot of fun. I am one of the people who does the Hugo award-winning SF Squeakcast, which is a podcast where we get together and talk about stuff we think is awesome in science fiction and fantasy. So that's my current career path.
So I'm assuming that all of you read the story, right? And so I thought we would start off just talking about when you read the story and what your experience was, because I actually hadn't read it. I heard about it everywhere, but I hadn't read it until I knew I was going to be on this panel, and I thought, oh, I'm going to moderate. I guess I better read the story. And you know, I felt a little weird tweeting to Ken that he had made me cry, but he had, and it was an interesting experience reading the story. I mean, I thought it was absolutely wonderful, but there was this sort of double experience, because I knew I was going to be talking about it, of feeling intensely with the story, not entirely being sure what I was feeling, because there were so many different perspectives, and I was, in some sense, sympathizing with the boy, right? And then, but also sympathizing with his mother. So there was this emotional response that I was having to the story, and then I was thinking, okay, what am I going to say about this story? How am I going to talk about it? So at the same time, I was having this sort of intellectual response, thinking about the story, including thinking about the fact that that I was startled that it was a story that I thought could appear in any mainstream or many mainstream magazines. That it wasn't something that screamed fantasy story at me. But it made me cry. That was my initial response.
Yeah, I left my pen in the bathroom. I gotta. I read it because it was Hugo nominated, and I was trying to do my due diligence and actually read things before I voted for them. Somebody said, and then I reread it again last week because of the panel, and my emotional responses on the two reads were very different. On the first one, I actually really disliked the protagonist, and I was very out of sympathy with the story. And on my second read, I realized that was actually intentional, and Ken this was not, I think I may have read too much slush, and this was not a story where the author was attempting to make us sympathize with somebody who was kind of a dick and who the author had never really thought about too deeply, but instead we had an unreliable narrator who the author understood had been kind of a jerk, but also he was a teenager, and we all have that experience, right, where we look back at our adolescent age when we're 25, 30, and we go, oh my God. It's like discovering that you've been an alcoholic and you have people to make amends to.
Especially parents.
Yes, especially parents.
I only read it the once. I'm not really much of an awards kind of guy. I think I stopped watching the Academy Awards last time when Paris was nominated for Best Picture. I couldn't believe it. And so I've always been somewhat cynical about awards, and I like Dora read it when I was on the panel. And I may be the outlier here. I didn't really like it. I thought it was incredibly beautifully done, at least from a sentence perspective. I thought it was a little, from a narrative perspective, I thought it was a little info dump heavy at the end. But the thing that struck me the most, and this is very much what Dora said before, I did not think really that this was a fantasy story, and I actually thought it would have been better if there had been no magic. If it had been just simple origami rather than magical origami, I thought it would have been a more profound story, because the magic threw me out of the story.
Why?
Because I thought various people's reactions to the magic did not make any sense, especially the scene with the other boy who comes to play over. What is the world? Is this a place where the magic is normal and people understand this? In which case, I can sort of see his reaction.
I can explain that when you're done.
But if it's not, and if that's the case, then there's really nothing. Then again, there's no reason for there to be magic. If it's normal, then there's no reason. But if it is a magical place, I don't care how much of a jackass modern child this other child was portrayed as, he still would have been at least intrigued by the toy instead of so simple, at least to my reading, instead of so you have a
that's a genre problem. I think for me, this story is very much drawing from the magic realism tradition, where magic happens and it's unusual, but it's just sort of taken in stride by the narrative, as opposed to the more traditional, or I shouldn't say more traditional, but our genre's more traditional urban fantasy structure, where the disconnect happens and everybody reacts to it with fear and surprise.
But doesn't in magical realism, isn't there more of a metaphoric purpose then to the magic?
Well, there is a metaphoric purpose to the magic in this, I think.
And I
it's sort of integrated into the world in magical realism. I mean, I sort of skipped over that in terms of plausibility and just thought they're kids and Mark is like, and kids sort of accept that weird things happen and Mark doesn't really question it. But I see your point, and one of the things that, and this is a genre issue, one of the things that we want as writers of fantasy is a world that's internally consistent, right? Which isn't always necessarily what you find in other genres. I mean, in even in literary fantasy, or like absurdist fiction, you find people turning into rhinoceroses and nobody notices.
Guy turns into a cockroach, everybody kind of goes, okay.
David Hartwell has a great line.
Did you lose weight?
David Hartwell has a great line about this, how in fantasy and science fiction, that the literary world doesn't understand that we take it literally. It isn't supposed to mean something else. It isn't supposed to represent something else. It is an allegory. It is a metaphor. It is literal. And the literary world has a very hard time understanding this. I've always thought this.
But I think in genre fiction it can be both. It can be
literal
and
absolutely
metaphorical.
And that is the one sort of issue I have, or question I have for this with this story. And this is coming out of my own background, which is that I come from an immigrant family. My family is Eastern European, and some of you are going, yeah, like either because you come from an immigrant background or you know my background. But my family escaped from communist Hungary when I was 5, and I came to the US when I was 7. So there was this whole family in this other country that I did not get to know. My grandparents spoke a different language than I did. I didn't really get to know them. I didn't really know their stories. And the story really spoke to me on that level, but there was something about it that the fact that his mother's Chinese and she can do the magic, and so the magic is kind of an aspect of her character, and it's Chinese and it's not American. It's opposed to kind of the ordinary American life that she's forced to live. And I guess the thing that makes me a little uncomfortable about that is that we do that so often. It's like this person is different and other but they have magical powers. Yeah. It's the other that always gets to be magical, and that's part of the specialness of his mother. And I did love that. But she is the magical Chinese woman.
I thought about that, and one of the things that, and I'm also not sure how I feel about it, but in some ways there's a commentary there on, as also from an immigrant family, although I myself was born and raised here. One side of my family is Ukrainian, the other side is Swedish, and Irish and German. And the thing that I've noticed in my own family is that I'm second generation. Both of my parents were also born here. Both of my parents are completely assimilated. You know, they have very, very few of their traditions left, and the ones that they have are mostly food related.
Best ones to keep.
Best ones to keep, you know. But so I've had to go out and sort of look for that heritage. So and that was the thing in this story that spoke to me on a personal level, is here's this kid who is the first generation, who is so determined to Americanize, to not be the weird foreigner, and then as he is later in life realizes that he's lost something, and maybe will try to reclaim some of that, or his kids will try to reclaim some of that. And I found that was the thing that was really personally affecting for me. That and his realization that he had been a dick to his mother and she was dead and he couldn't do anything about it now, which was very poignant.
See,
what did you guys think of? I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, I didn't get the fact that he really felt bad about having been a dick. To me, it was kind of
that emerged for me on the second read.
Yeah, I reread it to see if I missed it because my wife read it at the same time and liked it much. She really enjoyed the story a great deal. And I reread it again. Okay, what if I missed it? And I didn't even see it on the second read. I think it was probably because my sympathies were entirely with his mother, and I thought her story was much more interesting than his. So I would not call him an unreliable narrator. I'd call him a completely reliable narrator. He's just a dick.
Well, see, I think he's very, but for me, the whole story, the whole tone of the story is infused with regret, is infused with this sense of he does not let himself off the hook as he's
no, he does not.
Oh, that's interesting because the story is told from his perspective, and yet for some reason I didn't really read the story as being from his perspective.
Yeah, it's not.
He's
he's looking at it from his mother's point of view. Finally, as an adult, is how I read it. On the second read, on the first read, I'm like, God, this guy. Why am I? I don't like this guy.
The ending. It's interesting. I mean, what did you make of it? He's got the letter and he writes I, right, which is it's heart basically. It's like heart or love on it. And I was thinking, what kind of ending is it? Is this it's not a happy ending. Does it offer us something? Is it some kind of reconciliation? Is it, because really I think what happens is he can't communicate, right? Because his mother, remember on this celebration of the dead, used to write letters and send it in cranes, and she had the magic where she could actually send them back to the graves of her ancestors. She could still communicate, and he has lost that. And he's still got the tiger. He's got what she made for him, but he can't communicate to her that he loves her. And there's no way to do that because he doesn't have the magic himself.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad because, I mean, you see all the opportunity that is lost.
But she does suggest in the letter that she will come back to him, that she will attach. So he's making it's more an ambiguous ending. I think it's transformational in that he's had this realization that he's been a terrible human being, and that he deeply hurt somebody who loved him unconditionally. But there is some hope there. There is some suggestion that she will be able to come back to him. You know, because she is so adamant about on the Day of the Dead, open the box. You know, do this.
To my reading, all she's ever going to come back is in the letters. The way she actually comes back at the end is in the letters, and that's all there's ever going to be. And to my mind, even though I didn't really read him as being that upset about what he'd done, I still think, I as a reader at least responded with great sadness to the fact that this is all there was ever going to be. He had lost the opportunity, it was gone, his mother had loved him, she had been the most important thing in his life, and he never understood it at the time. And actually, in my reading of the story is, I don't think he ever even really understood it at the end. I think it was plain to the reader, but I think that that particular character as drawn was really not empathetic enough to see beyond himself, to really understand. I mean, this is just my interpretation. It's got nothing to do with whether, I don't know if I'm right or wrong. This is just the way I reacted to the story. That character as drawn, really, oh, that's nice, and he'd fold it up and maybe he'd read it again the next, you know, when they came alive again a year later. But that he's already 25. He's already got a certain callous spot in him, and I don't think. Maybe a change was implied that I didn't see, or a greater change.
I think his overwriting her letter, his own letter, that's just, you know, basically love, 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 indicates that he's trying to make amends in some respect. And I think the ambiguity is whether or not she'll ever know, and that's where the sorrow in the story comes from for me.
It's interesting. I just realized that in terms of the story, I don't feel sorry for the mother because she has had a very sad life, but she's had a full life. Like, she has had an actual life in which she has loved people, she has sacrificed for people, she has felt for people,
she's been very self-actualized.
done magical things. She has. And this is the
Such
guy
an
where
awful
you
life.
don't know. It is an awful life, and yet.
But she has agency.
But she has.
Yeah, but you know, I would rather have happiness than agency.
But you get the sense that she has lived fully, and this guy, I I mean, this is
No,
I think what you're getting to.
right,
He's
right.
so narrow, and you look at him and you think, he can write love, love, love on her letter, but is he actually going to have a good life? Because I'm not so sure.
How long is that girlfriend going to stay with him? That was one of the things that came through my mind.
Yeah.
How long is that girlfriend going to stay with him if he is still as emotionally stunted as he was with his mother? Yeah, but you know, it could be 10, it could be 15. But
Although I have to say, you know, in terms of my background, I mean, in terms of understanding where my parents came from, it took until I had kids, you know, and I mean, I wasn't telling my mother not to talk to me in any language because she would have smacked me. My mother was not like this. My mother is the strongest person I know, a little overwhelmingly so. But yeah, I mean, I think when do you start to understand and sympathize with and see the perspective of your parents? When do you start to see, oh wow, now I understand why they were doing all the things that they were doing? I mean, when did that happen for you? Because I don't think it was until after my daughter was born and she was like 5.
I'm still working on it.
I'm actually weird in a lot of things. I did not have a typical adolescence in a lot of ways. I mean, I went to all boys schools, and I was completely stunted in that respect. But I never rebelled with my parents. I mean, I fought like hell with them because I didn't necessarily want to do what they wanted me to do. But I never fought with them, and I always respected them. And I always knew they, you know, no matter how mad my father might get at me, I always knew he loved me deep down. I could do anything, and he would still love me. He might be mad, he might lose his temper. So with me, there was never a time when I made that process. You know, that may be, unlike you guys, I'm not a Mayflower guy, but my family's been in this country. We don't know when they came over. They didn't come over on a Mayflower, but we don't know when they came over. And they've all been farmers in the Midwest and the South and who knows what for 5 generations before we lose track of them. So I come from a very secure background in who I am and what I am as an American, so to speak. Even though my family was new to New York, and I was kind of new to New York when I grew up there. So for me, I mean, I think it's why I probably had so little sympathy for him and so much more for her, because I just looked for his mother, because I just looked at that as she's the one who's really had the hard life and has tried and has, as you said, has actively tried to do things, to fix her life, to have her child, to make up for all the horrible things that happened to her.
Saved herself.
And saved herself. And that's why, I mean, I just look at him and I go, you know,
Kid, you had it easy.
Yeah, you had it easy, kid, and you should know you had it easy, and the very existence of your mother should help you understand that. And one of the problems, I throw a question out to you guys. What did you think about the father in this story? I mean, I've talked long enough, but I have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think he's a non-entity.
Yeah, well, is that not a problem?
I think it is a deep problem.
Is that,
I mean, he's not supporting his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think of him as a non-entity. I think actually he's a very well-drawn character in brief flashes. I just think he sucks.
I think he's a very well-drawn non-entity. I don't think he's a non-entity in a narrative sense. I think he's a non-entity in a human sense.
He is, exactly. I agree with you completely.
I mean,
he's
sorry,
a very well-drawn non-entity.
Oh, he's not a non-entity in a narrative sense. He's a non-entity in a human sense.
Oh, okay.
You can see the kind of person he is, right?
He's not an engaged parent and husband.
No, not at all.
But why did he went out of his way to tell the story of how he married the wife anyway when she did not turn out to be what she was, which was a signal to me as a reader saying, oh, he's a good guy. And then he goes from being an actively good person to the non-entity. And I never could quite.
I think he's maybe more a path of least resistance guy.
You think so? Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't think
That
he's.
may be my misreading.
Well, I think he's, I think clearly he fell in love with this woman.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I get. But that he's not strong enough to stand up against his own. I mean, he kind of wants her to assimilate too, and she's kind of not doing it effectively enough. And he's not strong enough to say that's okay. and we don't need to live in the suburbs. I mean, the community that these people lived in, this was very retro for me, by the way, because nowadays anywhere you go, at least around here, certainly you have a very diverse
it has that real
population.
1950s vibe.
Yeah, and even in the 70s, I don't think it would have been as bad as it's described.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are parts of
It depends on where.
It depends on where.
So it
Yes.
depends on where.
Anywhere in a beltway suburbia where they have been homogenous for 2 generations, absolutely yes.
I would disagree with that. I would think certainly in some places, but I would not say anywhere. I mean, I've lived in suburban towns in the 70s, and they were not people. There were good people and bad people. I don't think you can be that damning of all of them.
People, but you knew who was normal and who was different.
There's actually an illustrative story from my own family history. This was before I was born, so I have it from my mother, who was the eyewitness. My first generation Irish grandmother, who was, a flaming redhead and was old enough to remember anti-Irish prejudice. What one of the neighbors, this in the 1960s, when my mom was in grammar school or early high school, one of the neighbors called up my grandmother, offended because do you guys know what neighborhood busting was? Where black families would have a white attorney buy a house and then they would move into an all-white neighborhood, a segregated neighborhood. A black family was moving into the neighborhood, and another neighbor was trying to get my grandmother up in arms. Well, what are we going to do about this? And according to my mother, what my grandmother said was, we're going to welcome them to the neighborhood. Says the Irish woman, go her, and marched down there with a welcome basket. And actually apparently caught a lot of crap for it.
I'm sure she did.
But I remember that from my childhood.
Yeah.
And my childhood this was not the 60s either. But I remember being a child, and I had another parent who was babysitting me because I knew her kids, and they were South American in some sense, and they were up around, this was the Washington, D.C. area. I don't remember exactly where they were from, but they were actually foreign, right? They were not American, and they were saying, but they owned the house. They said, this black person wants to buy a house in our neighborhood, and the person is actually going to sell to them. And that, I can't believe that they would do that the person selling the house would actually sell the house to this couple. And I was sort of like, but this was around the National Institutes of Health where my mother worked. I mean, there were people from all over the world in this area. This was Bethesda, Maryland. But this was when I was in elementary school. It was 70, it was in the 70s. So, yeah.
So, yeah,
It definitely exists, there's no question.
I think that it's the Brokeback Mountain problem, right? This family would have been much better off in New York City.
Which is the problem with the dad. I mean, why is he moving? He moves them to a place. He clearly has all the economic power in this family. He moves them to a place where he knows that his wife's not going to fit in or be welcome. And his child, too. Where he knows that his child's not really going to fit in. And that's why I think you're right. He's, as a person, he's a non-entity.
He's
See, I think he's a non-entity. I think also because he just didn't have as much place in the narrative structure as the other characters did. And I think as the other thing that bothered me about the story was I thought the author got a little lazy with the info dump at the end. And I think it's a little, the failure to add another line or two about the father, to bring him a little, even if he is a non-entity, to make that a little more clear, is also something that's missing.
There's an issue of craft in the story where information is not necessarily always presented early enough.
Yes.
But Ken's kind of an early career writer, and I think I'm willing to forgive that a lot more,
Okay, now wait a minute. Now let's talk about the awards.
Yes.
Because this won all 3.
Yes.
And yet we are sitting up here talking about craft issues in the story, and yet this is presented to us as the best story that year, or the story that's worthy of all of these awards and all of this recognition. Should it have been? Is that appropriate? Does it, and why? Why do you think this is the story that got so much attention? Because stories
'cause
that
they won
are
all three.
imperfect.
Well,
Well, but
yes.
why this?
Right.
Why did
Why
this
did it
story
win
win?
all three?
Stories don't have to be perfect to win
Right.
awards.
No,
right?
there are no perfect stories.
Oh, I would say there are some.
Maybe some.
I'm never going to write any of them. I don't have that ability.
I have
You know,
yet
you
to- yet
can
to read
say
anything I can't nitpick.
Borges.
By God.
I can see a Borges story. I can see saying that is, in fact, a perfect story. There's nothing you could change. But those are more like poetry.
Oh, now that I would disagree with, because I don't. If it's going to be poetry, then it's poetry. I would say Saki has written some perfect stories. I'd
Yeah.
say there are some perfect science fiction stories, maybe for a reader like me, not for other readers who want more value in the prose. But if for something I may not particularly, all I want is the functional prose, and the narrative itself to me is perfect. And that, to me, as a reader, is a perfect story. But to another reader, it
There
wouldn't.
you are. That's you know, everyone. Obviously, this was a good enough story for enough people. Writers, readers, and World Fantasy Award judges.
Well, it's a story that. I'm sorry.
No, and I think that probably that rests strongly in the emotional impact of the story. Emotional and thematic impact.
I think that's part of it. I think there's also something about it, and I will throw this out, and I think it'll be controversial, that I think that we, in this genre, tend to award things, tend to reward writing with awards that is literary and that fits almost uncomfortably within the genre, which is funny. That we tend to pick stories, because those are the stories of mine that get nominated for awards. It's the stuff that could, yeah.
See, I don't think it's boundary pushing at all. I think the story is a very conventional story. I think.
I would actually agree with that. I think it is.
I think it's pushing. No, I disagree.
I think
it's
as fantasy, it may be pushing boundaries.
That's my point.
But as literary fiction, I don't.
But we're not talking about literary awards, are we? We're talking about fantasy awards.
Well, and this comes back to your point of fantasy awards wanting perhaps to be seen as more like the mainstream, and then therefore picking stories like this to win awards rather than something that, even though he's been nominated thousands of times, like Charlie Strauss, which is not particularly literary at all.
But and the question is, but Charlie has been nominated.
No, that's what I said. I said he's been nominated, but that's maybe that was more for novels than with the stories. That was
no. He's been Lobsters. Some of his short stories have done very well. But my point is that there are ways in which I think the story fits into certain parts of the zeitgeist very well. It is conventional enough to not alienate people.
Yeah.
It is, however, it is pushing it's pushing some science fiction and fantasy cultural boundaries as we're becoming. In the current generation of writers, becoming much more aware of it's like so in the 1970s, suddenly there were women writers in science fiction. Actually, we had been there all along, but
code names.
not even under code names.
Yeah.
But in 1969, somebody went, "Oh my God, these ladies can write," and suddenly some of us started winning awards. And it's not that there haven't been writers of color in the genre all along, but suddenly the people who nominate for awards have looked around and started reading that work, and there's a boundary pushing aspect there in the fact that Ken is Asian, and people are suddenly aware that he's really that there are Asian writers who are really good,
And who are not touching.
and who are not Ted Chiang. And Elliot de Bodard, well, I think Ted was kind of groundbreaking. We were like, oh my God, this Ted Chiang guy can really write. Maybe we should look at some of these other Asian writers. Yeah, maybe you should. But like Elliot de Bodard, who's... Yeah, exactly. Both of whom have been kicking ass and taking names recently. And Lily just won the Campbell Award. So it's the fact that there's a cultural boundary there that is being pushed, and I think that that's part of what's going on here.
See, I would say
it's enough to make people slightly uncomfortable without being so unconventional that they are like, what the hell is this crap?
I have a question about that, because I'm writing a story right now that has this
Have you read Among Others? Which is also, did it won the World Fantasy and the Hugo, right?
No, it won the Hugo, not the World Fantasy.
Not the, but it was nominated for
Yes.
the World Fantasy and the Nebula.
It won the Nebula.
It won the Nebula. Okay, so last year's Hugo and Nebula winner, Joe Walton's Among Others, which I'm going to out myself. I'm one of the people who voted for it, for the Hugo Award, not because I thought it was a great history of science fiction, as many people did, but because I was absolutely freaking impressed with her craft, with the narrator. The narrator thinks there's magic in the world. The narrator thinks she has magical powers and there are fairies. In the structure of the narrative, it is quite possible that this young lady is suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia.
Who wrote it?
Joe
Joe
Walton.
Walton.
It's called Among Others. And Joe walks that line perfectly. You cannot tell if this is a reliable narrative or not.
Yeah, here and then here.
So I think that's another boundary that we're suddenly becoming aware of is.
Yeah, two things for the Joe Walton book. I looked on, my book club read that, and I looked online at an interview done with Joe Walton via IO9. She said that she doesn't think the magic is a metaphor. She believes the magic in the narrative of Among Others is magic. It's just a magic that she's felt to
Yes,
work.
but
Yeah,
it
but she's
doesn't
just
matter
the
because
it doesn't matter what
it doesn't
the
matter.
author says. Okay.
It doesn't matter. What matters
Once
is
you
the
put it out
craft of
there,
the book.
it's not yours anymore.
It's always a metaphor. I mean, it's always, even if it's literal, it's always a metaphor for something. You know,
And I'm not
Frankenstein's
talking
a
about
monster.
magic as a
He's
metaphor here. I'm
real,
talking
but he's
about,
still a metaphor.
yes, Joe believes that the protagonist is working magic.
But she's one person.
And the protagonist
And she's
believes
the
the
author.
protagonist is working magic. And yeah, and Joe's perspective is privilege, but the narrative never makes it explicit one way or the other, which is the point I'm making.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
I'd like to put in one more thing for the conventionality of the book, just to answer Elizabeth a little bit. I think this story does have a long history in science fiction and fantasy. It may not be as literal as this in terms of actually being actual immigrants in our actual society. But you know, what is slang but this story to a certain extent? What is
Well, all science
what
fiction
are
is
half of
outsider
Heinlein's
stories.
what are half of Heinlein's YA characters? But
Okay, the difference there is that those people do actually turn out to be special and
yes, yes.
exalted in some way.
That is true, and that in fact is what the old science fiction trope
Yes.
is that the outsider is the special one, and this is more realistic. But I don't think it changes the emotion of the reader.
I
as much.
disagree categorically on that one, because I think that those narratives, which we were just talking about in a panel yesterday, those outsider narratives like Slan and Theodore Sturgeon's The Dreaming Jewels, and they're all the story of the put upon ostracized person who turns out to be special and magical and have superpowers. That's very valorizing. This is the story of the put upon ostracized person who realizes at the end that he too has been kind of a bad person and could have done better. And I think this is a much more mature and challenging take on that trope. It does not comfort you by saying,
He also does
I won't
by
disagree.
saying, no, really, you really are a princess and your real parents have come to get you.
I won't disagree with you.
He was the heir to the magical tradition that gave it up, not even knowing.
And blew it.
He blew it.
Yeah.
And the question, I think, is, does he really realize at the end that he blew it? But that tradition could have been passed on from his mother to him, and it wasn't, because he wasn't interested in it.
Exactly, and that's where I think some of that boundary pushing. This is a commentary in that level on the slant type stories.
Oh well, yeah, and that I would agree. I would agree with that. But I just think there is precedent for it, and that I think a lot of the people who are actually voting for stories today are probably more aware of, are better read in the mainstream literary genre than they might have been 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, and I think that very much is reflected in the voting too. So that
and they've also read Le Guin and Delaney and
Right,
Zelazny, and
right.
which is as good as reading mainstream literary stuff.
Yeah. Yes.
Some would say better.
I mean, as good as in terms of broadening
Right,
the
yeah,
horizons
yeah.
of-
Except the thing is that Le Guin is mainstream literary stuff
Well,
at
yes,
this point,
exactly.
you know?
Oh, I would disagree with that.
I
I know very few people who have read. I discovered an amazing fact the other day. Though the schools were still separate at the time, my father is actually a college classmate of Ursula Le Guin's.
Wow.
He had never ever heard of her. And my father is a huge reader, mostly nonfiction, but he is, he reads the New York Times literary section cover to cover every week. He probably reads 5 books a week.
But he's probably heard of Doris Lessing.
He has heard of Doris Lessing, but he's never heard. But Lord Lessing comes at it from the literary side.
Yes.
Le Guin comes at it from our side.
Yeah.
If we need to put ours and theirs on it at all.
I guess-
But
Oh, we can totally
no, but
factionalize.
the thing about Le Guin is that she writes it from both sides. I mean,
Right.
because I read everything by Le Guin when I was a teenager, including like her Sand novels or stories, which are totally realistic.
Right.
And so when I'm thinking of Le Guin, I'm thinking but she's not. Our side doesn't know that side of her, and then I don't really know how well known that side of her is. But she writes completely realistic fiction some of the time.
Well, but our side does know it because you know about it, I know about it, you know it. I bet half the people in the audience know about that. And I would say not half of the literary mainstream people know about, have ever read The Lathe of Heaven, or what's like, I'm having a mind blank, The Tombs of Tulip.
Actually, I mean, Walter Mosley might be a better example.
That's probably true.
Because
Mosley's a better example.
he's ours and he's theirs.
Yes, that's
and
true.
and he's also mysteries.
Yeah.
He's got everybody nailed to the wall. Of course, it helps to be Walter Mosley.
But it
helps to be a genius.
But there's this whole generation coming up that's like Amy Bender and Karen Russell and
Karen Joy Fowler is another one who's jumped the.
Well, the fence has definitely been jumped.
Sort of, but Karen does either one or the other, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
but
I don't
even her.
see
Have you
somewhere in
read
the middle.
have you read the Jane Austen book club?
Yeah.
Yeah, but
right.
I love the whole. Well, here you can read my science fiction and I'll read your Jane Austen. And,
Yeah.
Oh wait, they both have something to offer. I mean, it's basically a polemic for bridge jumping.
Well, and Chabon does it, and Latham
Chabon,
does it.
I think they're better examples.
Well,
doing
they're
it.
because
They're being
because
allowed
they're
to.
clever men, they get more attention.
Yeah.
If I may borrow
But
Maureen
Amy Becker's
McHugh's great
doing it.
phrase. Yeah.
So they're younger women
Right.
writers who are inhabiting that space, and they're being recognized for it. But
Very good thing.
but yeah.
Yeah.
So that middle space. I mean, I think it's interesting that this won the genre awards, and in some ways, I think you're right. This is a more conventional story than something that Karen Russell would write, because they're in a very experimental space.
Yes.
And this is, in some ways, a fairly conventional.
Well, my experience with award nominations, my own self, is that it is those stories that are in some way conventional, they're some way comfortable, but also some way uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You know, my most successful story, Shuggets in Bloom, is a Lovecraftian pastiche, but it's a Lovecraftian pastiche where the protagonist is a black guy, and my intent. I had no idea when I was writing it. I was like, I was pissed off at Lovecraft.
Everybody's pissed off Lovecraft now, aren't they?
And I was writing it to, it was an I refute thee to Lovecraft when I wrote it. I did not expect it to have the traction it's had, but I think it's that balance of here is this narrative with which we are comfortable, and then here's an element that makes it feel a little bit edgy, that gets people's attention, and I think this story is doing that.
You had a comment.
A couple of things that come to mind. When you're talking about what stories win awards, and particularly when some of the comments you were making earlier about when awards started going to people from backgrounds other than the traditional one, I think one of the things you have to consider also, though, is what the competition was at any given time. Looking, for example, over the Hugo-nominated short stories for that year, I've got to say that my impression at the time, still today, was that it was a rather weaker field than it's been in previous years.
Do you remember what was? You mean the year that Ken won?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that in addition to the various considerations that you folks were talking about earlier, one of the things that has to be remembered was that this particular story won the Hugo that year, but it might not have won the award had there been a different group of stories it was running against. And the same thing is true, of course, with the, the issue was not so much that, I think, that we started reading stories by women or by writers of African American ancestry or whatever, and saying, oh, this is good, we got to start reading more like that, and that's why they won the awards. It's maybe that in the year that so-and-so won the Hugo, that as it happens, that particular novel was better than the other novels, or was seen as better than the other novels that were in the running that year. So that kind of historical thing you have to keep in mind.
I mean, but just by saying it's a lesser field, that's a judgment that you're making that somebody else might not make.
I agree.
And someone who prefers this kind of story might say that, I don't know the history of the Hugos well enough, but take an arbitrary world when, some super Larry Niven story won. Somebody who likes this might say that year was a very weak field. Look, it was all these stories about, science fiction exploits written by white guys that have no meaning to me at all.
Entirely.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is that one of the things that you have to keep in mind when evaluating the award is who was running against it at that time. The other point I wanted to make is simply, I wonder if this story couldn't be read as the triumph of the mundane over the fantastic.
How so?
Basically, it was the suburban environment, the desire for assimilation, the careerism, all the other things that drag you into the real world that, in the end, wound up triumphing over the heritage of the fantastic that the mother brought. And there may be a bit of wistful sadness at the end, but at least to me, I don't think that it is going to last the narrator that long.
I have a question about that. It may have won, but did it triumph? I mean, because at the end, what do we want? Are we going rah-rah Connecticut? Let's all get Obi-Wan Kenobi balls. Yay, Mark the Bully. I mean, what values are we, what are we feeling at the end? What do we want at the end of the story?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I agree with everything about your second point except your conclusion. So I'm with Dora on this
The
one.
mundane may have triumphed. It doesn't mean that we wanted the mundane to triumph.
Right, and I do think
there's
there's been, I think the point of the narrative is that there's been and I think this is actually one of the things that makes this a good story, is that the ending is ambiguous enough that we can sit here and argue about it for an hour, as we have been.
Yeah.
And everybody can defend their reading. We have a range of valid readings of this story, from this guy is never going to change to I think he's had a realization. Has he had an epiphany, right? And the story doesn't really answer that. It lets you, we're speaking of white space, it lets you read into that white space.
I'm sorry, you read.
No, that's good.
There's a line in there that really struck me. The line that most struck me in the entire story is, I don't have to copy it, but he says, he uses the exact same wording of selling himself to a corporation that he used for his mother earlier on. And I would say that line refutes whether or not, I mean, the mundane may have won, but it didn't triumph, because he wouldn't have compared selling of himself to a corporation the same way his mother sold herself to his father, which he abhors, if he had thought the mundane won, I think.
Well, and if he's not, that's to me one of the indications that he's not proud of himself.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that is maybe the one clearest indication that he's come to a sense of self-realization, that he uses that wording.
Yeah. And when we talk about the flaws in the craft of the story, the slight info-dumpiness, we should also talk about the strengths in the craft of the story, which is that intentional use of repetition to drive a point home.
And the origami, the way the origami is described. I mean, and that's,
I have such a crush on that tiger.
Oh, the tiger.
I want the shark. I want the shark.
Oh,
I want the shark. I want the shark.
The tinfoil shark is beautiful.
Described. I mean, this is wonderful magic, and I think that's what triumphs at the end, and he leaves us with that, right? I mean, he's got the tiger. That's what made me cry.
Well,
like,
also,
he refolded the paper back into Lau. He's still got that.
I had an epiphany.
Yes. In public.
In public. Holy shit, I'm sorry. Are we done? Okay, I will talk really fast.
Tell us your epiphany and we shall go.
All of the origami, all of the magical animals is made of mundane stuff.
Used wrapping paper, yes.
Used
You're
wrapping
right,
paper,
you're absolutely right. You're right.
tin foil, the scraps of stuff, and I think that supports my reading.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Oh, sure.
I'm sorry you didn't get your word in edgewise.
I talked to them, I'm so introduced you off the